So good evening from Warsaw, and as our panelists are in completely different time zones, good afternoon from Boston and good morning from San Francisco as well. The clock strikes 7. Welcome to our second webinar in the series. This one is entitled Synagogues, Historic Buildings Under Cultural and Educational Potential. We're meeting for a conversation with Helise Lieberman, Executive Director of the Taube Center for Jewish Life and Learning Foundation, and Dr. Glenn Kurtz, author of 3 Minutes in Poland, Discovering a Lost World in a 1938 family film. Welcome again. This is our second webinar. I'd like just to let you know that we previously discussed historical synagogues as historical traces. We learned more about the history of the masonry buildings featured in our project that I will speak about in a minute. And soon, on December 7th, we will meet for our last webinar, third, to talk about synagogues and the state of preservation and future prospects for these places, how we can best take care of them. This time we will meet with author and journalist Ruth Ellen Gruber, with architect and artist and designer Natalia Romik, and also with the director of our foundation for the preservation of Jewish heritage in Poland, Piotr Puchta. All of these webinars, as well as the website that I will feature in the webinar, are part of the Virtual Connections to Material Jewish Heritage project that has recently been launched by the Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Heritage in Poland, FODZ. And this project is a public task financed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland within the grant competition Public Diplomacy 2021. Let me now introduce our wonderful guests, as today we will focus on, together with them and their stories on the sites, historic sites and other items of material Jewish heritage in light of the cultural and educational potential of these objects and sites. We will be speaking with Ms. Helise Lieberman, who is the director of the Taube Center for Jewish Life and Learning based in Warsaw, in Poland, a former Hillel director. She was the founding principal of the Lauder Morasha Day School in Warsaw and has served as a consultant to the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv, Europe, the Westbury Group, Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, and to the JDC Baltics. Ms. Lieberman was awarded the Benemerito Medal by the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2015. She serves on the board of the Lauder Morasha Schools and Hillel Poland. And Ms. Lieberman has lived in Warsaw since 1994. The journey, because both our guests had their journeys and are on this sort of a journey to Poland, exploring their relationship with its Jewish heritage. And now let me welcome Glenn Kurtz, who is the author of 3 Minutes in Poland, Discovering a Lost World in a 1938 family film, which was named a best book of 2014. By the New Yorker, the Boston Globe, and National Public Radio. A documentary film based on the book, 3 Minutes, A Lengthening, directed by Bianca Stichter, and co-produced by Academy Award winner Steve McQueen, premiered at the Venice Film Festival in September 2021. So that's a fresh one, and has recently screened at the Telluride, Toronto, and Doc NYC film festivals. A 2019-2021 presidential fellow at Chapman University, and the recipient of a 2016-2017 John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. Glenn is a graduate of Tufts University and the New England Conservatory of Music, and he holds a PhD from Stanford University in German Studies and Comparative Literature. He has taught at Stanford University, San Francisco State University, and is currently on the faculty at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study at NYU. So welcome once again. It's a pleasure being here with you. As I said, we will be exploring the potential educational potential of these sites and items of material Jewish heritage. And I would like to start with a question to both of you, which Glenn will start answering and will present for a bit. And then we will come back to Helise. Visiting Poland is for many Jews from around the world a personal journey to the land of ancestors and of the Shoah. So can you share with us some insights and reflections about your own journey, what your journey was like? And I will stop sharing now so we can.
Well, thank you, Marta. Thank you, Helise, and thank you, Director Puchta and for FODZ. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure. And probably the best way for me to share my journey is to give you the presentation that I've prepared, which is sort of a very, very quick outline just of how this all started for me and the many different places that it's led to. So give me just a moment and I will begin. Here we are. Well, it started for me as something that I had never really expected, never anticipated in 2009 when I discovered a home movie in the closet of my parents' home that showed my grandparents on vacation. And there was a title sequence in this film, which said our trip to Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, France, England, and Poland, 1938. And I knew nothing about this trip or about really where in Poland they had gone, except what I could see in the film. And of course, the majority of it is just pure tourist film. My grandparents are standing in front of famous buildings, waving at the camera. But then there were these 3 minutes in the middle of it, which were quite different, which showed what was obviously, to me at the time, a Jewish town in Poland. And I'll just play for you a brief excerpt of this film. Of course, it's in color, which is extremely unusual. And I'll only play just a few seconds, but yeah, it's quite an extraordinary document. Well, that's it. I just wanted to play a brief segment so that you had a sense for it. The full film is available on the website of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and I think that link will be shared later if you're interested in watching it. When I saw this as an adult for the first time, it was a profound experience for me. I realized that almost certainly this was the only moving imagery of this community prior to its destruction. And that as a result, I was responsible in some way for the memory of these people. As I said, I didn't know what town it was, and I didn't know really anything about the circumstances under which my grandfather had made it. So that was the beginning of my journey. This sense of responsibility made me want to be able to identify the people, not just to say, oh, you know, these are Jews in Poland before the war, but to say really, who are they? What are their names? And we know what happened to them in general, but I wanted to be able to say, well, what happened to these individuals specifically? And that launched a 5-year research project during which many extraordinary things happened. And I will talk just very, very briefly about some of the things that happened. The majority of them are in my book, which I recommend to you. But one of the first things that I did, of course, was go to Poland. When I learned what town it was, I went back to this town. It is Naszelsk, about 35 miles north of Warsaw, 50 kilometers north of Warsaw. In 1938, it had a population of about 4,500 in the town itself, of whom about 3,000 were Jews. When my grandfather visited, that was the community that he filmed. by the end of World War II, of those 3,000, fewer than 100 were still living. And I went back to the town to try and see what kind of traces remained. And here from my first trip is a still from the photograph. And what I thought at the time was the place where the people were standing. In fact, it's probably a little bit farther to the right where that car is parked, but it is the same street. Well, so as I said, amazing things happened in the course of my search to try and identify the individuals. Among other things, I ultimately met 8 survivors who were still living, including 2 who appear in the film as children, one of whom is still living. In fact, he celebrated his 97th birthday last week. So it's an extraordinary story of discovery in its own right. But I think at this moment here, when I first visited Poland, the story, in a sense, branched into 2 different directions. There was the research into the film and the people who appear in the film, and then there was my relationship with this town. So I'm going to leave aside the one branch of the research that led to my book, which was published in 2014, and talk today primarily just about the relationship with the town that resulted from this research. And of course, the first thing that I wanted to do was to see what traces were there and to talk to people and to find out what, if anything, was remembered in the town about its Jewish community, anything that would help me understand what I was seeing in the film. And of course, if you talk to American Jews, typically if you talk to survivors or families of survivors and you ask them, well, what's left in the town? The answer that you're going to get is nothing. It's all gone. And that was the orientation that I went to the town with, the expectation that I would find nothing. And what I want to say today is that that's actually rarely the case. It's almost never the case that truly nothing is left. People remember. There are kinds of traces that perhaps you don't think about at first, but which are nevertheless very important when you begin to sort of pursue them and dig into them. When I realized, as a result of my research, I sort of had built this community of survivors and families of survivors, and then descendants like myself whose families had left prior to the war, I realized that in 2014, it was going to be the 75th anniversary of the deportation from this town, which took place in December of 1939, just 3 months after the German invasion. And I invited people to come back to the town with me. One of the things that I experienced when I first showed up there was a sense of great disappointment that there was no memorial, there was no monument, there was no public recognition of the Jewish population that had lived there. And I felt this to be, I felt it to be something that was missing, that really deserved to be there. And so the first thing was I invited this community back to visit the town with me. And here in 2014, approximately 50 descendants and 1 survivor and his family came back to the town. And it was the largest group of Jews who had been in the town probably since possibly 1939 and certainly 1945. We just spent 1 day, but I think that this event was actually the beginning of the real story that I have to tell about the relationship with the town. In the years prior to that, 2012, 2013, it was just me kind of poking around very quietly, trying to see what I could discover. But this was the first kind of public introduction into the town, that there was a community outside of the town that cared about the history of this town and the history of our ancestors in the town. And as I look back now, well, 7 years later, I realized that this was really kind of a turning point, although it didn't necessarily feel like it at the time. We were received graciously. The mayor of the town was very warm and met us and spent the day with us. There was a lovely luncheon. I had helped to organize a photo exhibit of photos that I'd gathered from survivors and descendants of Jewish life in the town. And I invited the whole community to come and join us at the opening. Then a couple of people did show up. We met with some high school students who had participated in the Forum for Dialogue's School for Dialogue, which was a marvelous experience for them. So we had interaction with the local community. But of course, we were there for 1 day and then we left. And it's very hard from the United States to tell what impact a visit like this has on the local community. So for the next couple of years, I can only talk about the impact that it had on the descendants community. One of the things that we thought was, well, there is a Jewish cemetery in town. It's completely overgrown. All of the headstones have been removed. There's, as it were, nothing left but the land. But the land deserved our attention, we thought. And so this was when I got in contact with FODZ, because FODZ owns that property. And we arranged to begin every year. We would come back for a week, 5 days and 7 days, and we would begin to clear the cemetery. And so for the next several years, a small group of descendants would show up, and in coordination with the Metseva Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization actually based in the United States, run by Dr. Stephen Reese, a marvelous, marvelous organization and a wonderful person. And we met every year for 4 or 5 or 6 days, and we cleared the cemetery. And here's a sort of before and after photograph of how things looked. And I think that this engagement with just the property, just showing up that it was something that was meaningful to us, and that it was that it deserved respect as a cemetery, as a sort of sacred site. I think that also, in a quiet way, had an effect upon the local community. And a couple of people would come out and help us. One year, some of the high school students came out and helped us clear for a day. But again, this was sort of, it felt like a little bit like a one-off. We arrived, we had these few days, we were there, we would meet a couple of people, talk, and then once again, we would leave. But I think coming back year after year was what really made the difference. We showed that we cared. And when we showed that we cared, other people, I think, recognized that this was a site that deserved respect. One of the years we erected a historical marker, which just gave a little bit of a history of the Jewish community of the town, which had been in existence for 400 years. And then we began to sort of wonder, well, what else would it be possible to do? And it was always our goal to try and get a kind of public recognition of the Jewish history that is, inextricably intertwined with the history of this town, to make that something that the town could be proud of and could recognize. Well, since this is a talk ostensibly about synagogues, let me talk very briefly about the Nichols Synagogue, because it will also play a role subsequently in the developments that have occurred since then. So the Nichols Synagogue, there was a famous wooden synagogue that existed from about 1750 till the end of the 19th century. It was then replaced by this stone and iron synagogue. Here's an early photograph from the turn of the century and then from the 1920s. It also appears in my grandfather's film. Here's another photograph, and you see from the market square how prominently placed the synagogue was. This is from the center of the square, and in fact, the buildings in the center of the photograph are the same buildings that appear in my grandfather's film, and the synagogue is right there, just off of the market square. This is a photograph taken most likely by a German photographer, and it does show military vehicles in the square in front of the synagogue. So during the war, the synagogue was first turned into a detention center and then subsequently used as a stable for horses. So by the end of the war, it was completely derelict. All of the religious artifacts had been removed or destroyed. In fact, there were these beautiful murals on the wall that the Jewish population was forced to scrape off with their fingernails during the time when they were detained there prior to being deported. And as a big hulking ruin in the middle of town, or right on the edge of the square, it was something that the local population, I think, didn't know what to do with, and perhaps felt was an intrusion now. Here are some photographs from the immediate post-war period. It was just a ruin in the middle of town. People took their photographs there. It was something of a site for I don't know, exploration, recreation, and conversation, I suppose. This became somewhat more obtrusive in the years immediately following. Of course, there had been wartime damage in the town, and there was some question about why this large pile of usable bricks was going to waste on the edge of town. And so at the end of the 1940s, the synagogue was nationalized, and it was subsequently torn down. And I often think of this as a sort of a great metaphor for the Jewish presence in Poland. So they tore it down, and the town administration distributed the materials to people throughout the town to help them repair their homes from wartime damage. So as a result, pieces of the Jewish synagogue are probably in most of the homes of the town in Nashelsk. And to me, this is an extraordinary metaphor. They are there. They may be covered up by stucco, but they are there. And in fact, as I learned in 2016 during one of our visits, other pieces of the synagogue had also been distributed. So one of the people who was responsible for allocating these resources to people in town apparently took a liking to the synagogue windows and installed them as a sort of little sunroom in his home. I received a tip from a friend and said, go to this address and look. And I realized these are the windows of the synagogue. So in this crazy way, perhaps on the one hand, we can say, well, this was Jewish property that was stolen. On the other hand, in this sense, it has also been preserved in a perhaps unintentional way. Nevertheless, these traces still exist. And we were able to make an arrangement with the woman who lived in the home to recover these windows and replace them with new, not drafty windows for her home. And so we came into possession of these final remnants of the synagogue, well, maybe in some sense, the most fragile pieces of the synagogue, which nevertheless are the ones that survived. And we incorporated these into a memorial, which we had designed and then was just installed, thanks to FODZ and Director Puchta, in March of 2021. Because of COVID, it sat in a warehouse for almost a year. And now it stands on the edge of the cemetery with this echo, let's say, of the design of the synagogue. Well, it was as a result of this, and this is the final part that I'll say in my presentation, that sort of these strands that had divided when I first arrived in town began to converge again. As a result of the research that I had done and the relationships that had been developed in town over the course of these years, I think somehow a mood had begun to shift in the town. And whereas at first we were, looked at from the windows when we arrived, but wasn't really something that that the town was participating in. When this memorial was installed, I was contacted by a journalist from the local paper who wanted to interview me and sort of talk about the significance of this memorial. And I mentioned that it was important to me and to the descendants community that the Jewish heritage of the town be something that the town itself recognized. And we felt that this would be, it was important that students learn that their town has this history, that this is part of their town's history. And the woman, Olga Iskevich, who interviewed me, is also a kindergarten teacher. And she then undertook to create a team of teachers. And together they created a curriculum for educating their students about the Jewish heritage of their town. And it's not the same kind of education, perhaps, that the sort of survivors and the descendants community had in mind. We want, I think it's typical for American Jews in particular, if they interact with Poland's, the first thing they ask is, well, what do you know about the Holocaust? That's not how the local teachers began to approach the question. Instead, they understood that for 400 years, this community was part of their community, that the communities lived together. And so they are approaching it from the point of view of the culture. What was this culture like? And so we have kindergarten students now who are learning the Hebrew alphabet, learning how to write their names with Hebrew characters and to act them out with their bodies. We have middle school students who are working with the Polin Museum, with this museum in a box, which is sort of examining artifacts and examining ritual objects and learning something more about the culture and the beliefs and what makes Jewish culture distinctive. And then high school students who are also working in the cemetery and helping to keep it clear and free of garbage, which is very, very meaningful, of course, to the descendants community. And then finally, there's cultural engagement with Jewish cultures. So we have high school students here who are learning Jewish folk dances. Well, I begin to describe how extraordinary it is that this is happening in this town, right? That that students in the high school are learning Jewish dances. It is a tremendous development, which is something I could never really have dreamed of when I first showed up in the town in 2012. And yet I think with the persistence of the descendants and the sort of quiet presence that we established by coming back every year and working in the property, this transformation has taken place, and it became possible to launch this kind of an educational initiative. So that's my presentation for today, and I'm delighted to talk with Helise and with Marta about their experiences.
Thank you, Glenn. I would like, I really appreciate also your sharing the educational impact on the town and how people started engaging with the culture once descendants returned and engaged with the place and the people, right? And the potential this meeting had. I would like Helise, especially with you, to come back to that a little bit later and ask also about how this potential is used with Jewish groups visiting Poland. But before we do that, let's keep it in mind. I'll repeat the same question to you about your personal journey to Poland, the place of ancestors for you as well, and also of the Shoah. And what is your experience? What are your reflections about this journey that you'd like to share with us today?
Thank you, Marta. Thank you, FODZ. Thank you, Glenn. I have already made notes to build on what Glenn has shared with us. And so maybe if you don't mind, Marta, just sort of segue, then I can move into my personal journey, which is like Glenn's. It's never ending. It's in process all the time. And I stress too that it's not an easy journey. There are a lot of challenges, especially I would say when I began my journey in Jewish Poland, I didn't know how complicated or nuanced or complex it was. And the beginning, it was a sort of a naive. I came in. First visit to Poland was 1991. I did not come with any particular association with the Holocaust. I came because I was invited to teach at an informal Jewish retreat in Richwald, which is in southern Poland. It was one of the third annual gathering. And here was an intergenerational group of Jews from Poland. And who were these people? I mean, I had grown up in the United States. I was very active in the Soviet Jewry movement. And Glenn, I don't know if you remember, and Marta, you've heard, but nobody talked about Polish Jewry. Nobody talked about it. It was like there was a giant cemetery and we weren't going to talk about it, but we were going to talk about it in terms of the Shoah, not the 1,000 years of history, and not the fact that there is a Jewish presence in Poland, that it's, and so, I walked into the store in 1991 in a world that had just emerged from communism, Jews who had not shared their Judaism or their connection or even their sort of, maybe I am sort of rooted in this religion, in this tradition, in this culture. They came out of joy. They came out of desire to learn. And the focus, and Marta, I believe that you were there, you were younger, I was younger. The whole focus is, what does it mean what could it mean to be a Polish Jew? And I think that's probably the first time in, contemporary history that question was asked. We were not allowed to ask it, nor maybe there was no space to ask it in 45 when Jews emerged from the camps and the ghettos and hiding and were repatriated, in hundreds of thousands from the former Soviet Union. That question became, not even on the radar after the state of Israel was born and people left Poland or were forced to leave in 1968. So here I walk into the story, into people, right? And it was their own, and learning slowly is, they didn't have any heritage, really, nothing personal, no nigun, no family, tune, no Kiddush cup that not even, not that you don't use. Oh, yeah, like for example, my father, that was my grandfather. No, nothing material or even spiritual. I wouldn't say spiritually, but sort of familial or communally tied them to Jewish life in a necessarily positive way. Now, I'm not saying people weren't positive, but I think it was my first recognition of the importance of heritage as something we carry with us, whether it's family or communal, and not knowing who you are and being told who you are by the outside and by history is a very difficult place to be. So I walk into the story. In fact, the proximity of the camp to Auschwitz-Birkenau was negligible, and I didn't go. I was there for a particular purpose. I wasn't denying that that's maybe an important site of Jewish heritage, of Polish Jewish history, of the world Jewish story. But so the first, the entree was into life. And that's where I continued, because as the founding director of the day school, I was looking forward. And I want to be honest with you, as friends and colleagues, I think that my lack of information made it possible for me to believe that everything was possible, which I still believe, but there was no hindrance. Well, history tells us many things we're not listening, and we should be. But there was no obstacle, because we have to do this. This is important. So where do I walk into the story in Warsaw, my hometown now? The synagogue. And it brings us back to why we're here today. I come to the Nordic Synagogue. It's the only synagogue that in Warsaw that survives the war and communism. I understand it became, like the meeting place. And certainly after the war it was, and probably at other points, but certainly in the early 90s, this is where people went. It didn't matter, how you were connected. The synagogue lived up to its name of Beit Knesset, in Hebrew, a house of gathering. And so if I had to choose, though I don't want to, one heritage site, one material heritage site that speaks to me, that drew me in, that continues to keep me connected to the past and the present, it would be the Nordic Synagogue. And it's, where you walk into the story makes, as you pointed out so eloquently, Glenn, how we walk into the story and what information, what curiosity we have, our ability to suspend the overlay of the tragedy and trauma of the Holocaust allows us to actually examine what that heritage, what we have, and how do we use it is really up to us. That's my journey.
I'll just interject for a second to say that while you were speaking about these places, we don't have Nordic Synagogue here, but I will show some of the synagogues that are included in the project. And the first one is the Synagogue of Zamoste. So our participants can also see a little bit of the virtual tours. And I'll give you back your voice. You can continue speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you for the visuals and taking us around Poland and seeing what FODZ has done and continues to do. And I think that one of the issues that comes out in terms of any kind of material heritage, and let's get back to that immaterial heritage, not immaterial, but not material heritage, is that how do we, and I said this before, how do we approach it? What do we allow, how do we allow ourselves to connect to it? And can heritage be a tool for healing? I have, as I go through this journey, and as I said, and Glenn acknowledges, the more you know, the more complex it gets. The more you know about Polish Jewish history, whether it was yesterday's history or 50 years ago or 500 years ago, the more complex it becomes. Narratives, they're not all black and white. Some are black and some are white, but mostly we live in a field of gray, which is not to be dismal. It's just variated. There seems to be, at one point I learned there were 264 variants in the color gray, which I'm sure more have been discovered. But if you look at it like that, you realize it's a vibrant color. It's not a non-color, it's a vibrant color. And in these shades of gray, for all of us to understand, and I think this comes from now being a Polish Jew, American woman, is how, again, do we look at it as a loss? How do we look at it as a loss, as a death, as a destruction and loss, which are two different things but interconnected? And how do we look at it as a treasure that we need to cherish and manage? Because we could look at it like this: there's, as you said, there's nothing left, or you can say, and this survives. So if you tell the story of this survives, we can actually explore all of those issues that FODZ, is front and center for FODZ, and the kind of work, Glenn, that, not work, your passion and work, you're so connected to.
Well, thank you for that. But actually, I'm responding to what you just said, and I think that it's so important. When I found this film, and initially when I first visited the town, I felt that what I was doing was creating a memorial. I thought that the film itself was a memorial to the people who were in it and who had not survived, and that the town was in some sense a memorial because the community that had lived there was destroyed. Of course, all of this is true and deserves recognition, and it deserves the solemn acknowledgement from all concerned that is appropriate. What I had, and also what I had never imagined was that both the film as a material trace and the town itself, with the material traces like the synagogue windows or the cemetery, could become a medium for living connections. And that's what I had not imagined. And that's actually, I think, what's been most surprising to me altogether, is that the film brought together a community of people who care about this history, who would otherwise, some of them maybe knew of each other, some of them are distantly related, but weren't really in touch, but it brought them together with a purpose. And that purpose was to preserve this history. And yet in that purpose, of course, we create in an odd way new history, right? People connect with family members, they become friends, they start sharing information, and something vibrant emerges from that. And it's not only true among the descendants community, it's true in the relationships with the town. Again, I had thought that we were going there to create a memorial or to, sort of insist that there be some kind of memorial there.
Which is an imposed, and not.
But in fact, what we've done is we've created friendships, and we have, sort of recognized that we're not only there to recognize and memorialize the end of this culture, but to recognize and in some way, not exactly revitalize, but to celebrate the life that was there and the culture that was there. And that, I think, it was completely unexpected to me.
So I think, oh, sorry, Marta.
Can I say a word?
Yes, I'm going to hold like this because otherwise my thought. Yes, I'm holding.
To build up on what you both are saying, because you've mentioned, Helise, also the reconnection of Polish Jews in the 90s and the early 2000s, and continue as it continues now from Rigveld, since Rigveld. We because we were deprived of that connection, a straight connection that you usually get at home. Because of the disconnection, we, most of us, a lot of us, also had this really impactful journey for our identities, for our heritage. We connected to the ways that Israeli Jews interpreted this heritage, or American Jews interpreted this heritage. And then we came back in a circle back to our roots, and Poland and Warsaw and Nasielsk and all these places that we come from, and confronted our own history time and time again, and tried to make sense of it. And we will never recreate what was, but we do want to draw on this life that Glenn mentioned, not only on the history, the tragic history, but mostly and more importantly to continue at least some of the achievements and wisdom and joys that our ancestors couldn't, pass on directly to us, but we can reconnect through art, through short films like the one you bring to the table, Glenn, and through resources such as Pauline Museum and many, many others that we, and our studies. And I think, as you, Helise, were saying, there's something very also therapeutic about this, for us, definitely, seeing a larger picture and reconnecting with our own ancestry is healing, is very powerful, painful, difficult, but it seems like, being here, we have no choice. We have to confront it, leave. So thank you for mentioning that. And I would like to continue from this into this question that I mentioned earlier to you, regarding the educational potential of these sites that some of which we've just seen, some of which we've mentioned, and also items such as films and memorabilia, things that we have in our families, to connect with this heritage for people from diaspora, from Israel. And we know that there are so many trips and visits to Poland, visiting this place and its heritage. What are your observations, both of you, and especially Helise, since that's the field that you're working at, Jewish heritage tours and educational workshops? What are your observations on this subject? Thank you.
Thank you for this excellent question. How do we have time to, can we make session 2, 3, 4, 5 to continue? Because you're opening up a lot of very, very important topics. The potential for education, but I use it as a vehicle for connections, right? We're talking about connecting. Education, yes. So if we look at the word connection, we need education, emotional, processing, and some kind of integration. And if in any of our encounters with heritage that are not a little bit more complex than this is this was that, the number of people murdered, it has to be a kind of a composite picture of before, during, after, now, so that we can actually allow people to be in the moment with a heritage site. And I don't mean we have to hug, but I mean, really, maybe I do. We have to embrace it. I mean, if I think now about the work the things that have happened because of Glenn's book, but also you said this very clearly, you're coming back. You don't just parachute in and you leave. You're not leaving a candle, you're leaving a mark. And I don't mean that memorialization is not important, but why are you memorializing it? Because this closes it in the past. And I mean, what Glenn has achieved, and I think others who are really connecting with their ancestors' town, and this is, I would say, the Jews who have Polish roots have an obligation to connect. And I'm not talking only about funding, I'm talking about going and being and connecting, because there have been, all right, how many decades since 1945? Communism prevented any kind of conversation or healing or connection, or even, barely with family members. We didn't even know who survived. I mean, Glenn, if you hadn't found the film, you would not have found the Jews of Nachelsk. Okay, they're not the pre-war generation, but these are Jews from Nachelsk. And this is a whole generation who are now finding their own way. And without this, they wouldn't be connected. Without this, the kindergarten teacher, it's a huge responsibility to take on our story. This is our story. How do you help people make it our story? And how do we, coming from the outside, with connections or assuming connections, or we have some kind of communal connection or feeling it's an obligation, how do we connect in a positive way? We can't expect others to do it. I mean, I've heard this before, I'm sure, from FODZ, you, Marta, and you guide with us and educate with us, and Glenn. Why don't you take care of it? Who's you? I mean, we need to take care of it. We need to both show that we're interested, because if you're not interested, and I am, that's possible. But if you're not and I am, why am I alone in this? If this is yours. So sorry, Glenn, go ahead. I see.
No, I think, you're raising such an important point. And I think one of the things that I ended up rather informally leading tours to this town, right? I invited people to come and work at the synagogue, at the cemetery. And as a result, every year I had the experience of bringing people who had many complex feelings about visiting Poland and about connecting again with this site of the murder of their ancestors, right? It's a very obviously painful thing to undertake. Guiding people through that experience, just sort of informally. And I think one of the things that is so fascinating is that the historiography, right? The way that we approach this history affects how people arrive, right? And that if we arrive with the purpose of visiting Auschwitz, or if we arrive with the purpose of memorializing, our murdered ancestors, then we have certain expectations of the community that we're going to encounter. Absolutely. And it was so typical of, people coming for the first time. They felt like, well, I'm not going to talk to a Pole. I don't want to engage with the community. There are certain stereotypes about Poles which we persist in maintaining out of our anger and our grief at what happened to our ancestors, and we want those addressed before we're going to, engage with people on any other level. And I think when we arrive with those expectations, it's going to be difficult to have a meaningful experience there. And yet over the course of a couple of days, right? And if that's your trip, you go, you do that, you leave again, then not very much is really going to happen. You will have had that experience. It may be deeply painful for you, but I don't know that you're going to engage with your history in a larger sense than with this most painful end of the history of the Polish Jewish community. Absolutely. But if you arrive with a larger sense of, well, I'm connecting with the life that was lived there, that came to this horrific end, right? We never forget that that was what also happened, but that does not encompass the entirety of the history. And I had this experience over and over. Where people would arrive with very hostile attitudes towards Poland. They would meet people, local people who were coming out to help us and who cared about this history also, and who respected that we cared about this history. And that experience alone changed the visitors. And they thought, whoa, not everyone conforms to this stereotype that I have in mind. And when you experience that, then it's like your anger has been blocking a kind of grief. and you
Yes.
experience
Yes.
the grief of that loss. But I
Right.
mean, I don't mean to be a pop psychologist, right? But
No,
in
but you're
experiencing
absolutely right.
that grief of loss, you then are open in a strange way to a much
Absolutely.
broader and richer experience. And you can recognize, oh, wait a second, I grew up eating, my grandmother made Polish foods. Like, I didn't even know that, right? Like, there's part of this heritage, which is part of my life, which, because I've been focused emotionally exclusively on how it ended, hasn't been available to me.
Yeah. And we quite agree. And I think this is what we're all working on together in different places, in different institutions, whether it's a tour or a guidebook, or it's an experiential conversation, or it's actually getting your hands dirty and rubbing off, the moss or the dirt off a matzeva, a gravestone, moving a rock that's in a path that you can't see, and also, I mean, until we can, as you say, overcome of our own stereotypes, our own fears, not have processed the grief or really acknowledge that it has a space. But in the Jewish religion, you sit Shiva, you mourn for those who are gone, but you choose life. And basically connecting to heritage allows you to choose life, right? I mean, it's kind of oxymoronish, but it allows you to say, look, this matzeva is the story of, I've recently become enamored with one of my family towns, Bielsko-Biała, which is southern Poland, and it used to be Austria-Hungary. And when the person who would talk about it, who's unfortunately I have no one to talk to about it, when he did though, he'd say Bielitz, which is the Austrian name of this town, Bielsko-Biała, but it was far away. And I went to the town several times now, feel very comfortable there, explain that. And looking for all the sort of the things to look for, right? Like there's still a sign over some store. It was Aaron Lichtenstein's paper store. Well, maybe that's where we bought paper. I don't know. So suddenly it's like, I went to the cemetery, and all of the graves, most of the graves, and there was another cemetery, they were 1960, the cemetery was flattened, and some of the matzeva were moved. And whose matzeva was moved? My great-great-grandfather. And I'm staring at this. I even have goosebumps thinking about it. He's mine, and I am here. And that's a very, it's like an appropriation. It's saying, okay, we are connected. And if it happens on a personal level, or if it happens on a communal level, or as part of a tour, but your sage comments need to be repeated. This is not, and you can't do this in 5 minutes, and you can't do it prescriptively, and you can't orchestrate it. You can only kind of curate the time and working through some of the issues, which we all have, right? I mean, for all of this time, there was no healing in maybe our communities or our families, but there was no healing in Poland. And we're in a strange space. Yeah. Those of us
and they're both very fraught issues, right?
Exactly, absolutely. This is very fraught. And I'm, we cannot minimize it. It's not fair, and we have to be very clear, but it's those of us who want to engage and want to find a way to do it. Then we need to come to the, sort of the 50-yard line, as they say, not the end zones where emotions might be, and rightly so, but here we are at a table, and what's on the table.
And I think material traces are really an interesting medium through which this can take place, right? So many of these material traces, you have to actually be there to experience them, right? The synagogue, whether it's been restored or whether it's in ruins or whether it's used as a bowling alley now, right? It's a building. And there's something, I think we have these mystical connections, right? Wow, this is where my grandfather stood, right? And now I'm standing there. And I think, so it's always, in a sense, both. It's always a recognition of the past and an acknowledgement of the pain of that history. Absolutely. And it's also a present experience that you're having by being there, which brings that history, in a sense, forward into you right now. And then the question becomes, all right, well, what role am I going to play in that history? And I mean, this was
and right, and in preservation and engagement. And I mean, you asked, Martha, I mean, there's so much to discuss. Thank you both for this opportunity. That, you know, what kind of educational approaches, you know, so even the way, as you said, Glenn and then Marta, how do you, what questions do you start with? Or what's the first, you know, I was thinking about this. If I stand out in front of the Nozik and say, this is my shul, this is a lot different than, this is Warsaw's only living synagogue. I mean, you can, it's basically two paths. And the question is, how do we make it possible for people to really have, these are portals. And I don't want to keep reusing that term, but they really are portals. If we create ways of people to go through them or experience them, then.
Thank you, Helise. We are approaching the end, but I would like to give our participants a minute to think of a question if they may. If they want to ask in a question and answers or in a chat, please type them in. In the meantime, while they're doing that, I know it's a long question, but I'll ask you to share, you know, in a more succinct way this time. But what I wanted to ask you was also, as we speak of these encounters, your encounter with the short film and with the town of Nashelsk and with the matzevah of your grandfather and the Synagogue of Warsaw, of Nozik, which are all material Jewish heritage. To you, what can you share something? I don't mean to you know, pry too much, but how has this affected, or has this at all affected your senses of identity, your, you know, who you are as well?
Well, I mean, it's had a profound effect on me. If I hadn't found this film, I doubt that I would ever have gone. I mean, it didn't feel like a place one could go to visit. It just felt like this kind of place that was destroyed. And so it's in a sense erased off the map. And what mattered then was just knowing the history, not going to the place. So the material trace of the film was, you know, really the only reason why I got involved in this. And then the relationship with the town and with the larger community, both of survivors and descendants. Yeah, it teaches me that this is where I came from, not only in a physical sense, but in a cultural sense. And it hasn't necessarily changed how I live my life per se, right? Just, you know, but it enriches something that gives me a sense of, all right, well, you know, there is this tragic, and I mean, tragic hardly captures how awful this history is. And there is also more, right? And just the acknowledgement that there is also more opens up a depth that is meaningful to me, and taught me something about my grandparents, whom I didn't know well. My grandfather I never met. My grandmother didn't care to share much of that history overtly, but it makes me recognize things about them that I never understood before, and so things about myself. I'll hand it off to Helise.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Helise.
Absolutely a profound effect, as Glenn says, I think on a daily basis. I have become much more aware of the past and the interplay with the present, and how it can be both contentious and disturbing and yet soothing. And that, you know, I used to think, please, that archives were old dusty things that some people in research may look for when they are writing their thesis. And I realized I have archives in my house. Those are collections of things that I put in a memory box. Things that made me who I am now, and memories and summers. You know, I don't equate that, of course, but I think it's brought home, you know, more about what heritage means, that it's a core Jewish value. I mean, we talk about it a lot, but I think it's really something that binds us together as a people. And if we really use it as a tool for learning and reaching out and not closing down and not, denying, then it's a real treasure to use it. And as you said, we need to know who built it and why, not who destroyed it.
We need to know both.
Yeah.
Well, we need to know both, but you can't you do a disservice if you only know one.
Right.
And so I think that heritage is the key to so much of who I am and who we are, if we allow it to be. So, Martha,
I just need to add to what you're saying, because it's so important that, and archives are not things, and heritage is not something that exists elsewhere, that is preserved by other people, right? I inherited a family film, right? It really was just a little tourist video that my grandparents took. And then people came forward with, these are the photographs of my grandparents, or these are the photographs that, my cousins sent to us and we preserved all these years. That's the heritage, and it's in a shoebox, it's in the closet, it's this thing that you don't think about very much, and yet that's the history that you carry forward, and that is as much the heritage as what's in the Polin Museum or at the Jewish Historical Institute or elsewhere.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again for sharing so much. It was such an amazing conversation. I was still kind of trying to wake up from it, but thank you for sharing your very personal experiences and your wisdom about Jewish heritage and your connections to it. I am very grateful. I can see that there is one participant raising a hand. I will ask, can you please type your question in the chat or in the Q&A part? Thank you for this meeting. I hope we can do this again sometime and continue the conversation. And as I said, we will be having another webinar on December 7th with Ruth Ellen Gruber and Natalia Romik. We will speak of the future of these sites, as there are some of them at least endangered. How can we help them survive? My name is Marta Eichelberger-Jankowska, and I thank you all on the behalf of the Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Heritage in Poland for being here with us, and hope to see you again. And let me just remind you, I will also share screen with the address of the website briefly. If you would like to explore more of these sites, that's the link. And that is also where you will find the recording of this very session. The link to the recording will be under a tab webinars on this website. Just in a few days' time. There is also the first session, and the third, we will open registration in a few days as well. So please be in touch with us. And without further delay, I believe as I don't see the typed in question, I believe that we can say goodbye to everyone. And once again, unless you want to maybe add a word of goodbye from Glenn and Helise, and thank you again on my end.
Thank you, Marta.
Thank you, Helise.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you to FODZ for making these conversations possible and promoting them. And let's keep the conversations going. Thank you.
Absolutely. These are hard and difficult issues, but they are worth talking about.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So good night and good day, depending on where you are. And see you next.
Good night, Poland.
Good night. Good night, Poland, and have a good day, America. And yes, see you next time on December 7th. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.